This lecture is on how SARS-CoV-2 came into existence and what SARS-CoV-2 attacks. So, how did SARS-CoV-2 come into existence? It evolved. That's how all new organisms come into existence. So, it evolved. And that then is how all new organisms, and organisms include all disease-causing organisms. So I'm going to put that down now. That is how all new diseases come into existence. So anytime that there's a new disease, that is another case of evolution happening in your lifetime. Now, more specifically, what happened in this case this is a virus that is present in certain animals, or rather one very like it is present in certain animals. Other animals besides us, that is. But it evolved just enough to be able to infect humans. So a few tiny changes in viral RNA wound up giving us our current pandemic. And this type of evolution, where you have a disease going from one animal and changing a little bit so it can then infect humans, this is known as zoonotic transmission. And these can be deadly. And the reason why they can be particularly deadly actually has to do with coevolution. Essentially, the animals that usually host these particular kinds of coronaviruses, have probably had them for quite a while, and over the many years, their immune systems have evolved along with those viruses. Essentially, the ones that had immune systems that lessened the destruction of the virus were the ones that were more likely to survive and reproduce. So over many generations, it wound up being that the usual host animals' immune systems learned to handle these viruses pretty well, or rather they evolved to handle these viruses pretty well. So as I said, there's a lot of coevolution that's going on here. But then when one of those viruses jumps to some other animal like us, then we wind up having the problem that our immune systems have no experience with that particular coronavirus or that particular virus of any variety. And so basically our immune systems are unprepared, and it can do sort of maximal damage, essentially. So this is what happens. So I'm just going to quickly write this down then. That I'm going to say the usual host animals, I'll put it that way. the usual host animals' immune systems have evolved to handle the pathogens, that is to say, the disease-causing microorganisms, the pathogens that they are usually exposed to. So, a virus that bats, for example, often have will not cause much damage in bats. The bats have had multiple generations of natural selection, selecting the individuals that have immune systems that handle that virus well. The other ones died. So the ones that survive to reproduce are the ones who have immune systems better suited to handling whatever that particular pathogen is. So as I said, it won't cause much damage. It won't cause much damage in bats. I'm actually going to put a dash there. Because their immune systems have evolved to deal with it. But if that virus becomes able to infect another species, like humans, for instance, then it may cause enormous damage. Because our immune systems have no history of dealing with it. And there are many examples then of all sorts of pathogens. I'm going to say bacteria, viruses, and so on. That cause no real damage anymore to their normal host. But wreak havoc. If they jump species. So that's how they came into existence. So now, what does SARS-CoV-2 attack? And this virus has spike proteins sticking out from it. Again, you've seen the pictures of the novel coronavirus, and it has these spikes. Those are what I'm talking about. Those things there, and I know they go all the way around. I'm not going to draw in all of them, but the point is we have spike proteins. That's what those are. And those spike proteins bind with receptors on cells. So I should explain here that the cells in your body, on that outer membrane that they will then have many different receptors on the outside. And those receptors are rather specific to particular things, a hormone or something like that. And you can think of it like a lock and key, where you will have this receptor and it is sitting around waiting for the appropriate key to come along and fit into it. And when the key comes along and fits into the lock, just like turning a lock on your door, which lets you into your house and enables a lot of other activities, when the receptor and the key, basically when the receptor and the other thing combine, then that winds up enabling a bunch of new things. It enables things to come into the cell, for instance. So what happens here then is we have these spike proteins on the novel coronavirus, and they bind with certain cells' receptors. Those receptors are already there, but the point is, instead of coming into contact with the usual appropriate thing, as I said, for instance, a hormone, where there might be an interaction with a cell, in this case, we wind up having that spike protein coming in and essentially picking the lock to enable the virus to enter the cell. So those spike proteins bind with receptors on cells that are called ACE2 receptors. That's the one that everybody knows about. Now, there is actually another receptor that we found out recently SARS-CoV-2 also binds with. And so SARS-CoV-2 then also uses receptors for another chemical that is sometimes in your blood, for transmembrane protease serine 2, usually abbreviated as TMRPSS2. I'm not too worried about this, but I just wanted you to hear this. So we have these two different kinds of receptors on some of our cells, the ACE2 receptors and the TMRPSS2 receptors. And the SARS-CoV-2 virus is able to interact with those cells that have those receptors. And basically the virus comes along, interacts with those receptors, and uses that as an entry into the cell. And then you're in trouble. Now, a problem here, a huge problem, as it turns out, is this. Cells with ACE2 and TMRPSS2 receptors are found in many places in the human body. So they're spread, these cells with these receptors are spread all over our bodies. So, including, I'll make that a dash as well. So including, and this is going to be a long list now, including the lungs, the lining of the small intestine, the linings of arteries and veins in, we're going to have another long list. So the linings of the arteries and veins in the oral and nasal mucous membranes, the nasopharynx, stomach, skin, lymph nodes, thymus, bone marrow, spleen, liver, kidney, brain, heart, eye, bladder, pancreas, and testes. So we have these receptors, the ACE2 and the other receptors, in cells widespread throughout our bodies, including in the linings of blood vessels, which is one of the reasons why we get blood clots from this disease, and all kinds of damage because we have so many blood vessels in so many places that so many organs can be affected. So the spike protein then interacts with the ACE2, that's a C, and TMR PSS2 receptors, and this is how the RNA from the virus then enters the cell. And once, of course, the virus is inside the cell, then you wind up having the virus's RNA taking over the cell's reproductive machinery so that it makes more viruses instead of making or maintaining the cell. So that is how we wind up then having this ongoing multiplication of viruses within the body. So the widespread distribution of these receptors in the body accounts for the widespread effects that COVID-19 can have on the body. And to be honest, in fact, although it is spread primarily through respiratory means COVID-19 should not necessarily be considered to be simply a respiratory disease. And that's the end of this lecture.